Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to talk and show you some audio and video for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation here at the front with it's 3 students, student-led. I've been told it won't be moderated. There will be no safety for me. Students are going to grill me. We have lots of room in the front. It's a long, narrow room, and I love feeling a sense of contact. I've been to my share of lectures, so I understand about sitting in the back so you can sneak out if it's boring, or checking your phone. But you can do all those things here in front. So if anyone wants to occupy this empty front row, I'd love for you to come up and be a little closer. I'm going to do a little storytelling and maybe tell you some things that some of you don't know. And those things are going to involve my own life and the lives of some people I've known. And sometimes when I talk about this stuff, I get a little bit emotional, because this is my life. Don't worry. As many times as I've told these stories, they're still very meaningful for me. So if I choke up a little bit, don't worry about me. But this is some pretty personal stuff. The general moniker for what we're going to talk about for a few minutes is why free speech is the only safe space for minorities. And I'm going to try to push back against what I think has become the leading, and in some ways the most important and estimable argument against free speech, especially in universities. And I want to start at Yale. In 2015, this is the courtyard of Silliman College. Many of you have seen this footage. This is Nicholas Christakis, then titled the master, the head of that college, in a very spirited conversations with students, and this is what one of them said.
I agree with that. Then why the fuck did you accept the position? Who the fuck hired you? You should step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. You understand that? It's about creating a home here.
It's not about creating an intellectual space. It's about creating a home here. Now, these students were ridiculed by some as being fragile snowflakes, but this student here, although I can't say I approve of her phrasing necessarily, is making an important argument, which is a university is more than just a place of academic discourse and research. It's the home for students who live there, and they feel entitled to be safe and to feel safe. The argument from safety has become a linchpin of thinking on and off campuses. Here are excerpts from 3 student manifestos. Again, I come out in a very different place, but I want you all to treat these manifestos and these statements with the intellectual seriousness which they deserve. The first is from Claremont students. Free speech has given those who seek to perpetuate systems of discrimination a platform to project their bigotry. Free speech projects bigotry, thus hurts minorities. Second, Middlebury. Free speech puts undue burden on specific groups of students, asking them to continually defend their right to exist in an academic community for the supposed intellectual enrichment of that same community. Making a similar point, which is where minority students, we should not have to face the burden of explaining our existence or tolerating hate speech. And third, Williams College, an ideology of free speech absolutism that prioritizes ideas over people, giving deeply offensive language a platform at the institution, will inevitably imperil marginalized students. What these ideas have in common is that people are going to be hurt by rough and offensive and bigoted forms of discourse. And those arguments have ramified in all kinds of ways, some of them rather peculiar. At Tulane University, for example, an author was scheduled to come and talk about his book about his white supremacist ancestors in the KKK. This was an anti-racist book. But he was deplatformed. He was canceled because some students said that the event was violent. The notion here is that harmful, hateful, hurtful speech is a form of violence and thus a human rights violation. And this kind of thinking has now moved into mainstream scientific discourse as well. This is Dorian Abbott, He's an astrophysicist at MIT. He was invited to give a scientific lecture on exoplanetary biology at MIT, and that talk, a scientific talk, had nothing to do with politics, was canceled when people at MIT objected to an article he had written against affirmative action in college admissions. We now see this kind of thinking in academic journals as well. Nature Human Behavior, which is a leading journal, just last year published new standards in which they reserve the right, I've reversed the order of these, reserve the right to refuse publication of or retract post-publication submissions that embody singular, privileged perspectives. Now, this is not a standard scientific criteria. Scientific criteria about is what you're saying, in fact, true? Is it accurate? Is it important? But they're adding this further criterion. People can be harmed indirectly. For example, research may inadvertently stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. Now, again, it can be easy to make fun of this stuff, but they're making a serious point, which is if research is even inadvertently harmful to minority groups, then it should be suppressed, or at least can justifiably be suppressed. Now, one of the results of this kind of thinking, there's a lot more going on here, but one of the things that's happened on university campuses is this. These are Knight Foundation polls over a series of years asking students if they feel comfortable or chilled voicing their opinions, the climate of free expression. And as you can see, the percentage who strongly or somewhat agree that the climate at their schools or campuses prevents some people from saying things they want rises steadily from 54% in 2016 to 65% only 5 years later. That's 2/3, and that's a rapid increase. It's about stable. But this is a little bit heartbreaking because universities are supposed to be the place of all places where folks feel that they can engage in robust discourse, experiment with controversial ideas. That's why we're here, in principle. Here are the sorts of things that I hear when I interview people on and about university life. Student A, I often felt like the only dissenting opinion on today's college campuses, the risks of engaging in debate of controversial topics vastly outweighs the benefits. I've heard students say this again and again. It's just not worth the potential cost of sticking your neck out and maybe getting slammed for causing hurt or offense. Certain points of view about touchy subjects never reach the surface. The result is an echo chamber. Again, tragic in an environment that is supposed to be about having multiple viewpoints. And this is from a professor who, by the way, has since left academia. I feel I am constantly tiptoeing through a minefield. I feel there is absolutely nothing I can do as a professor to stop this. It's like trying to hold back the ocean with the broom. He's talking about pressure from within and outside his department to conform intellectually to certain viewpoints which he does not share. Here's what's happening in society as a whole. This is the percentage who say the political climate prevents them from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. We're at about 2/3. This is very recent data, just a couple months old. That's pretty darn high. To put that in perspective, it's hard to compare the present with the past, but some political scientists tried, and here's what they came up with. They found about 4 times the rate, 3 to 4 times the rate of self-censorship in today's United States as in 1954, which is just past the peak of the McCarthy era. And if that surprises you, maybe it shouldn't. In the McCarthy era, people had a pretty clear and specific idea of what you could stay away from in order to be safe. If you didn't talk about communism, if you didn't sound like a communist, you were probably going to be okay. But no one knows exactly what the rules are today. Something that was okay to say yesterday can turn out to be deeply offensive and cause a social media campaign against you today or maybe tomorrow. And that's on purpose. The people running these campaigns don't want you to know what's safe. They want you to self-censor and neurotically police your own speech so that you'll never be quite sure if you're on terra firma. Here's the one of these that maybe bothers me the most. This is when people say cancel culture is not really a thing. This is the percentage who say they're worried about losing their job or missing out on job opportunities if your political opinions become known. What you see here is it's about 25% of the American public, and with the exception of liberals, it's everyone. Now that also may surprise you, but progressives and conservatives are worried about losing their job or job opportunities if they speak candidly and openly about their views. That is a high degree of chilling, and it means a lot of us are feeling frightened in America. So what can we say about this? Well, a lot, don't worry. I won't say it all, but I will now give you the 3-minute rush tour of free speech theory with Jacob Mchangama, the world's leading scholar of this, in the front row. This is hazardous. If someone storms out, that will be him and this will be the reason. But here are the two leading lights of American free speech theory. That's John Stuart Mill on the left, the author of On Liberty. Raise your hand if you've read it. Some hands went up. Everyone should. It's short. You can read it on an airplane. You'll love it. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, who just over 100 years ago coined the idea of the marketplace of ideas. There are 4 classical defenses of free speech. There are actually more, but I think this pretty well boils them down. And I am just going to mention them. I'm not going to elaborate because they are not why I'm here today. But just so you know, argument 1, epistemological, the argument from knowledge. None of us can see our own biases. None of us will catch all of our own errors. The only way we can learn is to criticize each other, spot and identify each other's biases. If we live in a no-offense society where we are afraid of criticizing others, giving our true views or hearing their true views, we will be in a no-learning environment. We will be an environment where bias merely perpetuates itself, and we will be shrouded in ignorance. And this is proven again and again over history in societies that don't allow freedom of speech and thought. Number 2, the defense from freedom. Dissent is a basic human right. Human beings cannot flourish in an environment where they are forced to lie every day, or be closeted, or cannot be their authentic self and cannot express themselves as fully and as completely as is possible within the boundaries of liberal law. Without the right to dissent, we cannot be our true selves, and this is a fundamental human right. Not just me saying that, it's the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the US Constitution, and so forth. Third, the argument from efficacy. Censorship doesn't work. It's been tried again and again. It usually backfires. It actually calls attention to the very thing that you're trying to censor. People don't know that Weimar Germany had very strong hate speech laws. They were used against the Nazis, and they became one of the Nazis' best propaganda tools. The Nazis put up posters all over Germany saying, what is it that Herr Hitler has to say that the authorities don't want you to hear? They were put on trial, the Nazis. They turned those trials into circus spectacles, elevated themselves. Censorship doesn't even work. And then finally, the argument from power. You have to create an authority if you're going to censor ideas. Who do you trust with that authority? People who favor censorship invariably imagine that they will be the censors. More often, however, they will be the target of the censors. And by definition, in a society with authorities, the authorities are going to represent themselves. The weak, the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the minorities will not be proportionally represented, by definition, by those authorities. Power, everywhere we see where we've had censorship, has been used to oppress. But that's not why we're here. Here's the one that we haven't been talking about. Here, to me, is the big missing part of the picture, and what I want to spend the next half hour exploring with you. And that's the argument for justice. Justice for minorities and for the marginalized. I am here to tell you that free speech, free inquiry, including offensive, bigoted, and yes, sometimes hateful speech, allowing that is the most important thing we can do for social justice. Here's someone who said so. You all know who this is, the second greatest American of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass. Made a speech shortly after in Boston, a mob shut down an abolitionist rally. He said, slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South. The South had rigorous laws against abolitionist criticism and tried to extend those laws nationwide. Douglas goes on to say this, a subsidiary point, which I think deserves to be carefully noted. Equally clear is the right to hear. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. At Washington College, for example, in Chestertown, Maryland, when the noted political scientist Robert George was deplatformed by a group of a dozen or so students who refused to let him speak, forcing him to cancel the lecture, everyone on campus lost the opportunity to hear this person. They did not consent to that loss. It was a violation of their rights. If you don't believe Frederick Douglass, John Lewis, one of the great heroes of 20th century civil rights, raise your hand if you've heard of him. Most people, thank you. Without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. I love that quote. It's just beautiful. Now, this is a man who literally had his skull broken fighting for civil rights. He knows the difference between words and violence. You all know who this is. You all know where he is. Raise your hand if you have read the letter from Birmingham jail. Lots of people. Those of you who haven't, please do. There's some wonderful performed editions on YouTube. Raise your hand if you know why he was in the Birmingham jail. Does anyone know? A couple in the front. Does anyone want to shout it out? Does anyone give it a go? We don't have any shouters. Yeah. Wasn't Selma necessarily, but that was a couple years later. But yeah. What Dr. King was trying to do was lead a peaceful protest with placards and signs. He was trying to exercise his free speech rights. As Time magazine reports, when he announced that he would ignore an unconstitutional injunction silencing him, as he led 1,000 people toward the business district, he was slapped into jail. He wrote that letter because he was in jail for his violated speech rights. Incidentally, it's fun to point this out. I want to show you the headline that Time magazine put on that squib. Free speech is never well-timed for the majority. Here's another person, if you don't believe me yet. This is Hosea Williams, one of Dr. King's leading organizers. This is a story that's told by Ira Glasser, who was the former president of the American Civil Liberties Union.
I was on a Donahue show once with Hosea Williams. Ira Glasser. We were discussing the rights of the Klan. He was on that show ostensibly to debate me about it, and he surprised everybody.
Head of the United States Civil Rights Commission.
Well, Phil, one thing we must understand, a right is not a right in America until it's extended to every American. And even though they beat and brutalize us in seeking that right, if they take the Ku Klux Klan off the cable today,
NAACP is next.
They're going to take the NAACP off tomorrow.
So?
I was Dr. King's field show. I organized a major march. The problem with the black struggle in America has been black leaders like King didn't have the ability to communicate with the masses. Once that ability to communicate with the masses, things changed.
Listen to what he's saying here. Think about this. He is defending the speech rights of the Ku Klux Klan. Who would do that on a university campus today? And by the way, what Republican member of the House wouldn't climb all over them if they did defend it? But I said I wanted to make this a little bit more personal. So I want to tell you a story about, I actually knew some of these people. 1954. This is the cover of One magazine. One is the very first, what we now call LGBT. It was then called gay and lesbian, actually homosexual in the day. So the first homosexual, openly homosexual literary journal. It had essays, politics, poems, that kind of thing. It was almost immediately targeted for censorship by the postmaster. Now, in those days, we had something called obscenity laws, and anything having to do with gay or lesbian was ruled to be obscene, and in those days, there was only one way to distribute a magazine, and it was through the mail. Or, of course, you could stand out on street corners, but that wouldn't get you far. So this is a world without internet, there's no Twitter, there's no social media, there's nothing but the mail. And a man named Olson, the Los Angeles Postmaster General, the person with jurisdiction, had a censorship code. One magazine publishes a cover essay written by its general counsel, you can't print it, which criticizes the Postmaster General's censorship rules. Folks, what I'm about to tell you will surprise you. The censor censored criticism of the censorship. That's right, this magazine was told it couldn't be published. One then sued. Here are the reactions of the district court and the appeals court. District court, the suggestion advanced that homosexuals, you can just hear the contempt dripping, that homosexuals should be recognized as a segment of our people and be accorded special privilege as a class is rejected. Note the move he's making here. This is the majority defining free speech as the right enjoyed by the majority. Speech of minorities is a special right. The US Court of Appeals affirmed in very strong language, cheap pornography, dirty, vulgar, and offensive to the moral senses, obscene and filthy, lewd and lascivious. Social standards are fixed by and for the great majority, and not by or for a hardened or weakened minority. Feel the contempt here. Brushed aside. Now remember, there's nothing pornographic in this magazine. The ostensible reason they censored it was because of a poem that invoked Sappho. Nothing pornographic about that. That's the world we were living in until this happened. This is the Supreme Court holding in a case called 1 v. Olson, the most important civil rights decision that you've never heard of and that I hadn't heard of until I dived into this work. It's decided January 1958. This is the decision. No, this is not the cover page of the decision or the summary page. It's the whole decision. That's it. It's called a per curiam decision. It's a 9-0 simple declaration by the court. In my opinion, they should do a lot more of these. The petition for writ of certiorari is granted and the judgment of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is reversed. That's it. That's all they said. But it was enough. I just want to point something else out to you here. That's the chief counsel, the pro bono lawyer, who pursued this case for one magazine and, in fact, wrote the cover article, You Can't Say That. I'd like to emphasize this is not ancient history. Eric Jolber was alive until 2022. A true hero. Straight man, by the way. Around the time of 1 v. Olson, we have this going on. This is what's known as the Lavender Scare. It's a massive campaign by the federal government, also state and local governments, to purge their civil services of homosexuals, who at the time were called deviants and perverts. Headlines like this every day. People losing their jobs, and not just their jobs, their entire careers. They would be outed to their families, they would be pariahs. They would often have to move, leave careers altogether. Often they would turn their backs on even by their families. Anyone heard of Frank Kameny? Sometimes one or two hands go up, just one. Frank Kameny was the most important gay and lesbian civil rights activist of the 20th century. It's a shame he's not more widely known. He's never even received a postage stamp. There is one block of one street named after him in Washington, D.C. Frank Kameny was a brilliant, Harvard-educated, PhD astronomer who fought in combat duty in the European theater in World War II, went on to be discharged, and went to work for the U.S. Army Map Service. And we'll let him tell you what happened to him next.
And as was mentioned, I had a position as an astronomer with what was then called the Army Map Service here in Washington. And one day I was called in by 2 Civil Service Commission investigators. They said, "We have information that leads us to believe that you're homosexual. Do you have any comment?" I said, "What's the information?" They said, "We can't tell you." I said, "Well, then I can't comment. And in any case, it's none of your business." I was fired. I proceeded to appeal all the way up to, I followed Rauch all the way. So I appealed through the Civil Service Commission and on up. They're just an executive branch agency all the way up to the White House without success, to the House and Senate, Civil Service committees without success, and eventually with the help of the ACLU went to court.
Most people in those days, in fact, pretty much everyone, did not fight these firings because they had absolutely no support. Kameny was very unusual in that he believed that the Declaration of Independence and the First Amendment of the Constitution were promissory notes written personally to him. So he pursued it everywhere. Here is an example of the mail he got back when he sought a meeting of himself, and he formed a group called the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C., one of the very first homosexual civil rights groups. They rejected the meeting. There would be no useful purpose served in meetings with representatives of your society. You'll notice the name of the person who signed the letter, John W. Macy, Jr. Tuck that into the back of your mind because we'll be meeting him again. Here's a typical letter he got back when he wrote to the US Congress, trying to get his job back and get the policy changed. This is from a representative. "Your letter of August 28th has been received, and in reply, may I state unequivocally that in all my 6 years of service in the United States Congress, I have not received such a revolting communication." He went to the Supreme Court. ACLU represented him through the appeals process, but would not take him through the US Supreme Court. They were worried, understandably, that he would lose the case and set a bad precedent. Kameny was not one to be deterred. He wrote the brief himself as his own lawyer. You can get this brief today. It is the first civil rights brief filed on behalf of LGBTQ people at the Supreme Court. It's a magnificent document. He says 2 things here that I want to point out are important. In World War II, petitioner did not hesitate to fight the Germans with bullets in order to help preserve his rights and freedoms and liberties and those of others. In 1960, it is ironically necessary that he fight the Americans with words in order to preserve against a tyrannical government some of those same rights, freedoms, and liberties for himself and others. He understands here that speech is his weapon, and he also understands the stakes. The Commission's regulation, as it stands, is unconstitutional in that by establishing a tyranny over the mind of its citizen, it is inconsistent with and violates the provisions, stipulations, spirit, and intent of the First Amendment to the federal Constitution. Now, this is an employment lawsuit, right? He wants his job back. So why is he talking about tyranny over the mind? It's because he understands that by suppressing speech and freedom of expression, the government is doing more than regulating employment. It is reaching deep into the minds of Americans to say homosexuals are not your equal. In fact, they are deviant and sick. And that's fundamentally what he's getting at. Kameny and his group and his allies do not stop. In 1965, July 4th, they lead the first LGBT civil rights protests. Here they are. I'm sorry I couldn't get a less fuzzy video, but here they are, walking in their Sunday best in a circle in Lafayette Park in front of the White House. They also did one in front of Independence Hall, Philadelphia. They understood their symbolism. You can see some of these signs going past. They're not exactly catchy. Protest Civil Service Commission policy, but they're making the case. Imagine the bravery that these people took, showing their faces in front of the White House. Here's a clearer photo. That's Frank Kameny right there. And you see that woman's reaction? I love that. It's like, what the F? What are they doing? And that's how everyone reacted. Kameny goes on, 1971, to become the first openly gay candidate for the US Congress in a DC delegate special election. He doesn't win, but he puts up a pretty credible fight. First big victory, 1973. I was born in 1960. For the first 13 years of my life, homosexuality was a mental disorder. And I understood that as a kid. I understood that if I ever acknowledged to anyone I was homosexual, I could be sent for therapy. Therapies on occasion included electroshock, lobotomization. You all know what happened to Alan Turing. If you don't, shame on you. Google it. 1973, in response to the activism of Frank Kameny, a working scientist, remember, that policy is finally overturned and the diagnostic Manual of Disorders, the Bible of the psychiatric profession, is changed. 1973, you can see that shift here. 1975, second big victory for Kameny et al. Not him by himself. But in the wake of a number of court decisions, the United States Civil Service Commission, the agency that had fired him, changes the policy. And there it is. Persons cannot be disqualified from federal employment solely on the basis of homosexual conduct. This is revolutionary. Some years later, 1993, District of Columbia, Frank's home jurisdiction, repeals its sodomy laws. In 1960, every state in the Union criminalized homosexuality. And believe me, they were enforced. That changes in DC in 1993. That was something he was especially proud of. 1995, not all that long ago, Bill Clinton finally rescinds the ban on security clearances for gay and lesbian people. We were considered a security threat because we were subject to quote-unquote blackmail. Of course, the only reason we were subject to blackmail was that we could be fired for being gay. Bill Clinton finally removes that in 1995, clearing the way for thousands of LGBT people to work in jobs in places like the Justice Department, the FBI, and the Pentagon. This is not ancient history. Frank Kameny lives long enough to be handed the pen by President Barack Obama when President Obama signed the first executive order granting civil rights protections to gay, lesbian, and transgender federal employees. He lives long enough to see those signs that you saw be adopted into the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, where they were displayed, among other places, alongside Muhammad Ali's boxing gloves. And this is my particular favorite. Kameny was given a personal apology for his firing by the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. Now, OPM was the renamed agency that had been the U.S. Civil Service Commission. It was the agency that fired him. There has never been, to this day, a United States government apology to homosexual Americans for the 50-year reign of terror. But at least Frank Kameny got a personal apology, and its Theodore Roosevelt Citizenship Award. And the man here delivering that apology to his, on the left side there, is John Barry, the director of OPM. And John Barry is, would anyone like to guess, openly gay. One man's adult lifetime.
The Civil Service Commission had its name changed. It's now the Office of Personnel Management, and directed by an openly gay man. Mr. Macy of the Civil Service Commission back then must be turning over in his grave. Oh, how I wish he were alive to see that. Oh, how I wish he were here.
So in the end, Frank Kameny wins his battle with John Macy. My role in this begins in 1995. Same-sex marriage has become an issue. The nation's in a panic because the year earlier, Hawaii seems to be on its way to legalizing it. This becomes a hot national issue, and I begin to think that same-sex marriage is possibly the most important civil rights idea of my time. In September of 1995, I'm now 35, just turned, my father goes out on a walk with me and urges me, in fact begs me, not to become a spokesperson for same-sex marriage. Not because he didn't love me, not because by then he had a problem with my being gay, but because he thought this was such an outrageous, ludicrous proposition, men marrying men, women marrying women, that I would no longer be taken seriously as a journalist or public intellectual if I advocated such a crazy view. And that was not a stupid thing for him to say. This was a real possibility. Now, I'm no hero. I didn't face those things. But I started just writing at every opportunity. I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. It's all I have, words. So January 1996, I was at The Economist. We produced the first major endorsement of same-sex marriage by any large mainstream publication. New Republic, a much smaller magazine, had come out in favor of it a few years earlier. I wrote a book about it. Every opportunity, I talked about it. I thought, when I began that work in the mid-1990s, that we were talking about a work of generations. I wasn't sure that I'd live to see it, if ever. In 2004, President Bush and his allies got same-sex marriage on the agenda of about 30 states. We lost all of them. It was the most comprehensive defeat, arguably in the history of recent American politics. You could argue we lost 31 out of 30 because Arizona voted twice. Yet, 2010, only 6 years later, that's me and my husband Michael getting married in the courthouse in Washington, D.C.
Under and by the virtue of the authority conferred upon me as branch chief of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia, by the Congress of the United States of America, I now pronounce you legally married. Congratulations. You know how to do that.
People ask me, how did this happen? Because it's an incredible story. A lot of things had to happen. Gay people had to come out. The social environment changed for a number of reasons. But really, only one thing happened. We did not have friends. People say, why did you go to the courts with same-sex marriage? Why not do it through the legislature? The answer to that is that not one state legislator in one state legislature would even introduce a marriage bill. Well, what would you do? You'd probably have to go to the courts. We had no political support. We had no money. We were a pariah class. The public was dead set against us. We had only one thing. We had our voice. We had our arguments. We had what Frank Kameny had, which was, at every turn, the ability to confront the haters with love. And that's what we did. We understood that every instance of hate was an opportunity for us to spread our message. It platformed us and gave us the opportunity to contrast ourselves. Here are 5 things. There won't be a pop quiz, but here are 5 things that I'd like you to think about. First, it's not the hate, it's the hate, not the speech. The main reason that people support hate speech bans is, of course, that they oppose hate. They thus oppose the expression of hate, but these two things are not the same. Solving hate by banning hate speech is like solving global warming by breaking all the thermometers. All it does is make the hate harder to hear, harder to identify, harder to confront, harder to root out, or in many cases, the opposite. Further platform the hate by making a lot of people think, what is it they're trying to hide from me? The only way to address the problem of hate is to go after the reasons for hate. Most Americans don't wake up every morning looking for someone to hate on. Some do, most don't. Hate comes from fear and ignorance. And if you believe, as people believe then, that homosexual Americans pose a security threat, seduce children, and bring God's wrath down on the country, you will hate homosexuals. If you understand that those things are false, that they're not true, you might come around. And that's how you combat it. Second, words aren't violence. Something some of you may have heard. When people hear speech that is marginalizing, hateful, offensive, this activates the same portions of the brain that are activated by physical pain. So we should equate these things, hurtful words, with hurtful actions. That's not right, and here's why. If someone calls me a fucking faggot, or says homosexuality is a disease treatable with therapy, I have some options. I can reframe those statements, for example, as the person actually saying that they need counseling, not that I'm a fucking faggot. There is agency. There's exchange in the interpretation of speech and views. If, on the other hand, someone assaults me with a baseball bat, I don't get a say in whether my skull is broken open and whether I survive. The attempt to equate words with violence is an attempt to make words violent. And it is an attempt to stigmatize criticism, which inevitably involves offense. The whole point of public criticism, of saying, you're wrong, I'm right, here's why. Sometimes in ways that are rude and challenging. Sometimes in ways that are very wrong. But the whole point of that is to expose those points of view that are inadequate and need correcting, and that will always be a painful process. There is no way to criminalize offensiveness without also criminalizing science. Can't be done. Third, don't protect us. You know, if you think about it, the arguments that are typically used to marginalize and oppress a group have to do with protection. That's how the majority justifies these things. Slavery, Jim Crow. The rationale for that is that African Americans are weak-minded, they're childish, they need the protections of the peculiar institution. They're too childish to hack it on their own. Women, why don't they have equal rights with men? It's for their own good, because they're the weaker sex. They're more vulnerable. Homosexuals, think about the words that have been applied to us. Limp wrist, sissy, pansy. Words connoting weakness, inability to confront the hard things in life, deserving of contempt. One of the worst things that we can do is to confirm the stereotype that we are weak by the first time, or the second or third time we hear something offensive said about us, running to mommy in the form of a university administrator or whoever and demanding protection. We are not fragile flowers. We are not snowflakes. I heard Frank Kameny in direct dialogue with a member of the Family Research Council, a deeply anti-gay group. Frank never backed down from a controversy or conversation. I heard him say, if you believe your God supports the oppression of people, of me and people like me, then you worship a false and bigoted God. That was frank. And I feel the same way. Some of you may be surprised that I believe in bias incident reporting. You've all heard of bias incident reporting. A lot of colleges have these now. If someone's biased against you, you can report it anonymously, and the administration will investigate it in some way. I favor bias incident reporting, but the kind I favor is if you're biased, report it to me. I want to hear about your views on homosexuality. If you're against same-sex marriage, or even if you think homosexuality is a disease treatable with therapy, come and tell me. We'll have a conversation. I'm not fragile. I'm not weak. I'll give you a civil set of arguments, and you can go away and think about them if you want to. Seeking protection just self-marginalizes. Fourth, the burden is a gift. So I understand why minorities find it demeaning and humiliating and exhausting to justify their existence to the broader population. And that's what we had to do. Go door to door, begging straight people, oh, please, Mr. Straight Person, can't we get married too? Can't we have what you have? Oh, well, I don't know if you're ready. Well, I can tell you that that doesn't feel great. And I understand that for minorities, being in this role of having to educate, do moral educating of the people around you is taxing. But here's something we forget. Being in the position of a moral educator is a privilege, not just a burden. Doing the work that I've been able to participate in, making the case for gay and lesbian equality, now LGBTQ, making the case for strengthening marriage by making it more inclusive has been the greatest privilege of my life. And if you allowed me to rerun my life and be a member of the straight, white, Christian, God-fearing majority, depriving me of the opportunity to do that moral work, of course I would turn it down. The injustices of society are always better perceived from the margins. The minorities are always the canary in the mine shaft, the first to see when there's social justice work to be done. And yes, that's hard. And yes, we should embrace the opportunity to do it. It is a privilege. And finally, in some ways, this is the closest to my heart. I hear a lot of LGBT activists now, especially on campus, who want to deplatform and silence those they disagree with, those who make claims about sexuality or transgender or race that seem deeply bigoted and offensive. And I see that and it breaks my heart, because it forgets we were canceled once. In fact, canceling, depriving people of their jobs, their livelihoods, their reputation, their place in polite society because they believe incorrectly, canceling was invented in America and refined on homosexuals. We were the people who were deplatformed, fired, silenced, driven out of public view, driven into the closet. We have not been fighting all those years so that we could then turn the tables and do the same thing to others. We were fighting for the opportunity of all Americans, yes, including bigoted and offensive Americans, to live as their own true, authentic selves. And to the extent that we forget that, to the extent that we allow ourselves to get into the business of using speech codes, cancellation, censorship as a weapon, we betray what should be our creed, which is this. Never forget, minorities are always better off in a society that protects hate speech than in a society that protects us from hate speech. Minorities are always better off in a society that protects hate speech than a society that protects us from hate speech. Because in the end, the most marginalized of any minority group is the dissident, the heretic, the blasphemer. It's the most unpopular person in any majoritarian or authoritarian culture. And we, seekers of social justice, seekers of minority rights, seekers of equality, a fairer and more inclusive society, must always take the side of the dissident, even if the dissident offends us. Last word to our friend, Frank Cameron.
Here we are now. You heard the presidential proclamation, the very idea back then that the president would actually say something like that, that he would have a reception to celebrate Gay Pride Month, would have been unthinkable. So we have moved ahead over the last almost exactly half a century from the depths of ignominy to, well, we have a way to go yet, but to awfully close. I mean, a meeting like this in a government building would have been inconceivable. Absolutely inconceivable.
Thank you all.
Well, first of all, John, thank you so much for that talk. Very insightful. I know I was taking notes, really engaging the material, so we appreciate you coming here. I can kick things off with a question that I came up with, both based on reading your book and on the talk you presented today. So you speak a lot on free speech being this safe space for minorities, but obviously that isn't the only thing in the space. We have to take into account historical context and just people feeling like they're on equal footing when they enter these spaces. So my question is, what else do we need to guarantee, if anything, to ensure that free speech is able to be conducted and not used to further isolate individuals?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, for doing this. I enjoyed meeting you earlier today. What a wonderful set of students Vanderbilt has. So you'll be not surprised to hear I wrote a book about that, and it's available here for free, and I'm happy to sign it for anyone who nabs a copy in the back. It's called The Constitution of Knowledge. So the fact that people have the right to say obnoxious, stupid, and wrong-headed and bigoted things doesn't mean they should. And it turns out societies need ways to regulate the way we talk that without requiring us to be nice, because that gets into authoritarian territory, encourages us to be nice. And we have a system for doing that, and I call it the Constitution of Knowledge. And it's a set of rules and institutions that says, look, if you want to be taken seriously as someone who advances knowledge and gets promoted in academia, or makes a living in journalism, or is reputable as a lawyer, and so forth, you need to follow some rules about how you talk to other people, how you approach ideas. You try to avoid ad hominem attacks. You focus on their arguments. You try to make rational empirical claims that can be tested systematically by others. I could go on, but these are the rules of discourse that you all are learning here. It's changing you as individuals. And we can't force you to follow the Constitution of Knowledge. But it turns out that by incentivizing it, we can turn the energy of conflict, I'm right, you're wrong, no, I'm right, you're wrong, into the light of knowledge. And we do that without heavy-handed government intrusion. But we do need to defend those norms and rules, and we do need to remind people of them, which is why I'm glad to be here and be part of the dialogue project at Vanderbilt. I just before he got here, I got a few minutes with the chancellor. And he said that one of his priorities, he takes every opportunity he can to remind people of these values, of how we should behave in discourse. And that's the right answer. You can't make people be nice. You don't want to make them be nice. But you can try to set rules and guidelines that will encourage it.
Thank you. Is anyone else?
So kind of building off of that idea that we need to be able to have, like, under certain parameters in order to have these discussions to build knowledge, like what you talk about in your book. Another section you kind of go through is the idea of cancel culture and how our universities are continuously being more skewed towards the left, that we lack the intellectual diversity that's important in order to check biases. So how should schools like Vanderbilt consider intellectual diversity within their student populations, within their professors? Like, what does that practically look like on a campus?
Meaning what can students do, or what should universities do, or both?
I would say both, what it looks like in a practical setting.
So this is a challenge. So okay, without rambling too much, there are three conditions that you need to make the constitution of knowledge work at a university or anywhere else. One is what we've been talking about: freedom of speech, inquiry, and thought. That's what gives you the new ideas, the new hypotheses, and the arguments that drive knowledge forward. The second thing you need is the discipline of fact. That's the constitution of knowledge. Those are all the rules and institutions and incentives that keep people grounded in things like follow facts, check your evidence, don't make stuff up, do empirical testing, replicate experiments, all of that stuff that you're learning here. That keeps us grounded in fact. And you need that discipline, or else people can make stuff up and do all the time. The third thing you need is viewpoint diversity. In a room where everyone agrees on the basic assumptions, learning will not occur because some of those assumptions will be wrong but won't be tested. You've got to have sufficient viewpoint diversity in a scholarly environment so that all of the assumptions, or at least many of them, will get tested. On that last point, a lot of departments and disciplines in American academia are following down, and I could reel off the statistics at great length. It's not every department or every discipline, and it varies from place to place, but it's possible now for an academic in a field like anthropology, sociology, communications, education, to go all the way from undergraduate through PhD program, the tenure process, an academic career, and retirement without meeting a single conservative. That becomes problematic because it harms the research. It means not enough alternatives are getting considered. Okay, so what do we do about that? There are groups that have organized within academia to try to work on it. Heterodox Academy is the most prominent. It's now organizing chapters. It has a diverse group of academics, right, left, and center, who are arguing from a scientific viewpoint as scholars, not a political viewpoint, but they're saying, look, in order to do our work, we need to aerate these fields and make them more open. We're also going to have to do, I think, universities need to do some research on their own campuses to understand the climate for politically unorthodox scholars. Now, this can be anonymous survey research, but it has been done in places. Universities need to know, does a conservative scholar feel comfortable here? And what do they think could be done to make them feel more comfortable? About a third of American graduate students openly acknowledge discriminating against conservatives in decisions about tenure and promotion and grants. And that's just the ones who acknowledge it. I think it's 25% to a third. So universities need to look at this, they need to audit for it, and then they need to make intellectual diversity a part of the hiring process. It's all too easy for people in academic departments to hire only people who sound like themselves, who see the world the way they do. Although I'm not dogmatic about this, as some people are, I have come to see diversity DEI statements as problematic. I think they are being used as litmus tests in too many places. So I think it's time to rein those in. And I also think students have a role by being outspokenly interested in hearing points of view that may be unorthodox on campus, welcoming and engaging with speakers who may be conservative or evangelical or whatever the role may be. If students demand to hear those people, if they want those voices in their departments, they will get them.
So two questions for you would be, where do you think the apprehension from even having these debates on campus comes from? And what should LGBTQ students and allies, what are some actionable steps you can take to get over that hurdle of not wanting to have uncomfortable conversations?
Well, the step I take, Ari, is the talk you just heard. I want to help students, 2 generations now younger than I am, but who are members of minorities generally and LGBTQ minorities specifically, to understand why it is in their interest as members of minority to allow a diversity of voices, including voices that they think are wrong and harmful. And that's for the sake of promoting social justice and a campus environment where ultimately the right conclusions will be reached. So I try to talk to them. I try to tell this story. I don't think a lot of people, I could be wrong, you tell me, I'd like to ask you this question. But I'm not sure a lot of people in your generation know the stories I'm telling, know the names that were up here on the screen. So what I tell them is what I've just said. And I would urge them, okay, if you want to hold a sign up in the room, if you want to picket in front, if you want to do another form of peaceful protest, that's great. Make your voice heard. But don't deprive anyone else on your campus of their voice, because that's the very kind of oppressive conduct that we faced. It's so easy to forget. It wasn't that long ago when the people who were unable to speak on college campuses because their views were considered so wrong-headed, offensive, dangerous, and blasphemous were gay and lesbian voices. Oh, please.
So, I mean, your book touched on a concept that you called spirals of silence very, very well, which is basically when people avoid talking about controversial issues because they don't want to stick their neck out, and then you just kind of spiral into where no one talks about an issue. I unfortunately fell victim to that for that very same debate. I was supposed to moderate and was ultimately given an ultimatum that, so this was while I was running for a student government position, and my options were moderate the debate or my running mate yanks the plug on that campaign. And I didn't moderate the debate. So how can you, with your talk, how can we then convince our fellow students that you should put your neck out and make tough decisions?
So this is possibly too personal a question, so feel free to duck it. But how do you feel now about the decision that you made in that case?
I think it's the biggest decision, the biggest regret of my life, honestly.
Why?
I didn't stick true with my principles, and I wish I had in the moment. And I went with the flow, and I should have done more. I should have done what I thought was the right thing in moderating a debate.
And what brought you to that conclusion?
The two previous debates that I'd moderated, the first one was about affirmative action, which was a wonderful debate, and the second one about a federal heartbeat bill, also a fantastic debate. And I had just seen how constructive those conversations were. I looked at the pre-poll and the exit poll, and people had actually changed their mind in very constructive ways. And I was happy to be a part of that.
And that realization came to you after you had made the decision that you regretted?
Yeah, I mean, I basically went all in on the election, and then had
Did you
to
win the
sacrifice.
election?
Of course not.
So it was all for nothing.
I wouldn't say all for nothing, but it was a learning experience.
So what should someone, I or your fellow students, have said to you in that situation that might have helped support you in what you eventually came to think you should have done?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's what shouldn't have been said. A lot of people told me it's not worth it to do this. Don't be ridiculous. This is not the main goal here. It's just a sideshow. I wish someone had told me the importance of free speech.
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of a general response because standing in your shoes or anyone's shoes is hard. But time was 5 or 6 years ago, not so much now, that the most common question I would get from students when I talked about this issue, very often from a white freshman or sophomore male, was, what do I say when someone in a class or a social conversation says, you're disqualified from talking about this because you're a white, cisgender male, heterosexual male. And they would say this with real distress. And I tried a bunch of one-liners, and then I finally realized, it took a long time, but I finally realized the right answer to that question, the best answer I could give is, I don't know. I'm 63. I don't know what the best way is to reach a student your age at Vanderbilt right now. How you can reach your fellow students and how you can develop the kind of supportive environment where you'll have friends and colleagues and advisors around you saying, you know what, Ari, the only thing that you really have in life is your integrity. And only you can preserve that, and no one can ever take it from you if you keep it. So think twice before you compromise on this. I can't create that environment. And the question is, can you? And so now what I say when I'm asked the question about how do I stop this kind of silencing or deplatforming is I say, you know, here's the important thing. It's not what you say in response. It's that you keep saying. When someone comes and insists that you shut up or be marginalized in a conversation, ignore them. Find your voice and keep talking. Don't let yourself be intimidated or bullied, because later you'll regret it if you are. I'm not sure if that would have helped in your situation, but.
Yeah, that would have helped. I met with an advisor and they told me the opposite, so.
It's always so much easier to go with the flow, and sometimes that's the right answer. You got to pick your battles, right? I understand that. And so these decisions aren't easy. And it's also not something that an isolated individual can do on their own. One of the things that Chancellor Diermeyer was saying before I got here is it's important to build a supportive culture around free expression and free speech, because a single isolated individual is so vulnerable to groupthink, to social pressure, to being marginalized and condemned. But if there's a group of people around you who will protect each other and defend and promote these values, it gets much easier. So I think a lot of what has to happen, and what is starting to happen, is groups of students and groups of faculty getting together on campuses, creating societies for free speech and free thought, defending these things collectively. There's a new group, relatively new, it's called the Academic Freedom Alliance. And it's a group of academics across the country who form what they call a NATO for academic freedom. In other words, an attack on academic freedom anywhere is an attack on academic freedom everywhere, and will unite all of them, regardless of their ideology, in pushing back. And I think that's the right approach. Thank you. It's an amazing story.